In the endless deserts of North Africa, the sun burns mercilessly. Men fight not just the enemy, but the sand, the heat, and the thirst. Here, in the early 1940s, one man dominated this unforgiving battlefield, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Known to both friend and foe as the Desert Fox, Rommel was cunning, daring, and always unpredictable. He struck fast, vanished into the dunes, and reappeared where least expected. His victories in 1941 and early 1942 had turned him into a legend. British and Commonwealth troops both feared and respected his name. But by the autumn of 1941, everything was about to change. Because somewhere in that vast desert, a group of Australian soldiers, dusty, inventive, and irreverent, would hatch a plan so bizarre and brilliant that it would completely fool Rommel. They wouldn't beat him with bullets or bombs. They'd beat him with plywood, paint, and deception. The Desert Fox and his empire. To understand the scale of the deception, we first have to understand the man it was designed to defeat. Erwin Rommel wasn't just another Nazi general. He was a legend, the kind that soldiers on both sides admired. Rommel had built his reputation during the early campaigns in France, where his bold tactics shattered Allied defenses. When Hitler sent him to North Africa in 1941, he transformed a struggling Italian army into a fighting machine, the Afrika Korps. ST, unpredictable, and absolutely fearless. Rommel used the desert like a chessboard, always one move ahead, always striking where the enemy least expected. British soldiers nicknamed him the Desert Fox. Even Churchill, his enemy, called him a great general. But as the war dragged on, cracks began to appear. Rommel's supply lines stretched thin, his fuel and ammunition depended entirely on Axis convoys sailing across the Mediterranean. And by mid-1942, those convoys were being torn apart by Allied aircraft and submarines. Without fuel, his tanks sat useless in the sand. Without ammunition, his guns were silent. And yet, even weakened, Rommel was still dangerous. In June 1942, he captured Tobruk, a major Allied fortress, taking over 30,000 prisoners. The victory shocked the world. Now, Rommel's army was just 60 miles from Alexandria, and the road to Cairo, the Suez Canal, and the Middle East oil fields lay open. If Rommel broke through, the British Empire would lose its lifeline to India, and possibly the war itself. The Allies were desperate. They had to stop him at all costs. That's when a new commander arrived, a man named Bernard Law Montgomery. Montgomery was disciplined, methodical, and determined to rebuild the shattered Eighth Army. He knew that if he was going to defeat Rommel, he couldn't just outfight him, he'd have to outthink him. And for that, he turned to a plan that would depend not just on strength, but on deception. Australia enters the fray. Among the soldiers of the Eighth Army was a proud and battle-hardened unit, the Australian 9th Division. They had already proven themselves at Tobruk, where they held off Rommel's siege for 8 long months. They earned the nickname, the Rats of Tobruk, and they wore it proudly. Now, in late 1942, they were back-seasoned, gritty, and ready for payback. But this time, their role would be far more unusual. Under Montgomery's plan, the Australians would form the Northern Strike Force, launching the main attack. But before the first shot was fired, they would help create a vast illusion, one that would trick Rommel into looking the wrong way. And to make it happen, the British called in a very special group. The camouflage unit, a mix of artists, engineers, and illusionists. Their commander was Geoffrey Barkis, a filmmaker turned military deception expert. His team included painters from the London theater scene, sculptors, and even magicians. But the Australians, tough, inventive, and quick to improvise, soon became the backbone of the operation. They knew how to work with whatever materials they could find: tin, canvas, rope, and desert scrap. One Australian sapper later recalled, "We weren't soldiers building a base, we were stagehands building a lie." Their mission was simple, yet incredibly dangerous. Build a fake army so convincing that even the Desert Fox himself would believe it. And if they failed, thousands of men could die when the real battle began. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary acts of deception in the history of warfare, a masterpiece of illusion that would forever change the course of the Second World War. Operation Bertram begins. In September 1942, as Rommel's army dug into its defenses, the Allies began preparing for the showdown. Montgomery called it Operation Lightfoot, the plan to smash through the Axis lines at El Alamein and drive them out of Egypt for good. But before the battle began, Montgomery needed to deceive Rommel utterly and completely. To do that, his staff created a secret plan known as Operation Bertram. It was one of the boldest deception operations in military history, a complex web of camouflage, fake equipment, and psychological warfare designed to make Rommel believe that the main British attack would strike in the south, near the desert plains of Katara. In reality, the real attack would come from the north, led by the Australians and British infantry. The task of creating this illusion fell to Geoffrey Barkis and his team from the British Camouflage Directorate, and to the ingenious Australian engineers of the 9th Division. Together, they would transform the empty desert into a massive stage, set a battlefield of illusions. The fake army, The first step was to build an army that didn't exist. Using wood, wire, and canvas, the Australians constructed hundreds of dummy tanks, artillery guns, and supply trucks. Each one was made to look real from the air, complete with painted shadows and fake tracks leading up to them. They even built dummy camps, with tents and cook fires to sell the illusion. At night, real supply trucks would move into the area, their headlights carefully choreographed to mimic constant traffic and reinforcements. By dawn, the trucks would vanish, leaving behind a convincing illusion of a massive buildup in the south. From above, it looked perfect. To Rommel's reconnaissance pilots, it appeared that the British were preparing a major assault on the southern flank. But that was only half the trick. The pipeline illusion, the Australians took deception to the next level with something ingenious, a fake fuel pipeline. Rommel's intelligence officers constantly monitored Allied logistics, knowing that an attack couldn't happen until enough fuel reached the front lines. So, to make Rommel think the British weren't ready yet, the Australians built a dummy pipeline using old tins, pipes, and bits of scrap metal. Each day, they extended it about 5 miles slow, steady progress that looked completely authentic from the air. To German observers, it meant that the British couldn't possibly attack for another 2 weeks. In reality, the real fuel lines were already hidden underground near the northern front, ready to supply the actual attack. The dummy pipeline was nothing but a mirage, and Rommel swallowed it whole. But the most brilliant part of Operation Bertram was something called the Sun Shield. Invented by a British engineer, it was a lightweight canvas cover that could disguise a tank as an ordinary supply truck. During the day, entire armored divisions were hidden under these sun shields. To enemy aircraft, they looked like nothing more than columns of harmless lorries. Then, under the cover of night, the crews would remove the covers and drive the real tanks north, replacing them with dummy vehicles to make it appear that the trucks hadn't moved. By the time the deception was complete, the Germans believed there were only a few weak infantry units in the north, when in reality, hundreds of real tanks were waiting there, ready to strike. The Australians had helped create an invisible army, hiding in plain sight. Operation Bertram was working, and Rommel had no idea what was coming. Rommel falls for the trap. By mid-October 1942, Rommel was convinced that the British would strike in the south. His reconnaissance aircraft confirmed it, a massive supply buildup, pipelines nearing completion, and constant vehicle movement in the desert. He moved his panzer divisions, his elite armored reserves, toward the southern flank. Meanwhile, the northern sector, where the Australians and British infantry were massing, was left dangerously thin. Rommel was walking straight into the trap. He didn't know that every tank he saw, every vehicle, every road, was a carefully painted illusion. Even his radio intercepts supported the deception. False chatter, fake reports, and staged activity all pointed south. On the night of October 21st, Rommel received his final intelligence briefing. The report concluded that the Allied offensive was at least 2 weeks away and would likely strike south of Ruysat Ridge. Satisfied, Rommel ordered his men to hold their positions. 2 nights later, his world would explode. The Battle of El Alamein, October 23, 1942. The desert was silent for the last time. At 9:40 p.m., the British artillery unleashed hell. Over 880 guns fired at once, their shells streaking through the night. The sky turned white, the ground shook, and for 5 hours straight, the Axis lines were buried under a storm of steel. Then, under the cover of that bombardment, the Australian 9th Division and British infantry advanced. The Australians pushed into the northern minefields, the toughest stretch of the entire front. Machine guns raked the sand, artillery shells burst overhead, but the men kept moving. Step by step, they carved a path through the wire and mines. Behind them, engineers followed, clearing safe routes for tanks to pass. By dawn, the battlefield was chaos, smoke, fire, and dust, so thick it blotted out the sunday. Rommel's headquarters was overwhelmed with reports of a massive assault in the north. His first reaction was disbelief. He had been sure that the attack would come in the south. But now, the Australians were tearing open his flank. He scrambled to move his panzer divisions north, but it was too late. The deception had done its job. For the next 10 days, the Battle of El Alamein raged across the desert. The Australians fought like demons, pushing forward under relentless fire. Rommel counterattacked again and again, but his reserves were scattered and exhausted. By November 2nd, his defenses began to collapse. Rommel sent a message to Berlin. It read simply, "The army is not in a position to hold." The Desert Fox, the man who once ruled North Africa, had been beaten, not by overwhelming numbers, but by a phantom army that never existed. The Australian spirit, when the smoke cleared over El Alamein, the cost of victory became clear. The desert was littered with the twisted metal of war tanks half buried in the dunes, silent guns pointing into the sky. But amidst that devastation stood the men of the Australian 9th Division, exhausted, wounded, but victorious. They had fought in some of the harshest conditions imaginable, blistering heat by day, cold by night, rations running low, supplies thin, and the ever-present sand grinding into every weapon and wound. Yet they pressed on, driven not by glory, but by grit. These men weren't professional illusionists or military planners. They were mechanics, farmers, miners, and artists, ordinary Australians who used their wits and hands to create something extraordinary. One Australian sapper later said in an interview, "We didn't have fancy equipment. We just looked at what we had, old oil drums, bits of wood, bits of wire, and figured out how to make the enemy see what we wanted them to see." In many ways, the deception of El Alamein captured the true Australian character: resourceful, inventive, and quietly audacious. They didn't just follow orders. They improvised, adapted, and created. They brought imagination to the battlefield, a weapon Rommel never expected. To the Australians, deception wasn't just trickery, it was survival. They understood that sometimes the smartest soldier wasn't the one who fired the biggest gun, but the one who made the enemy fire at a shadow. For Rommel, the defeat at El Alamein was devastating. For the Australians, it was vindication proof that courage and creativity could stand shoulder to shoulder. And though their names rarely made the headlines, their work in Operation Bertram would inspire generations to come. Legacy and lessons. The success of the Australian-led deception at El Alamein echoed far beyond the desert. It became a blueprint, a manual for future operations where illusion could achieve what brute force could not. Just 2 years later, the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception that convinced Hitler the D-Day landings would come at Calais, not Normandy. Many of the techniques, dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, camouflage artistry, were born from what the Australians and their British allies had perfected in North Africa. Operation Bertram had proven that the art of war could literally be art painted, sculpted, and staged for an audience of enemy generals. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy was human. After the war, many of the men who built the fake armies returned to ordinary lives, painting signs, teaching art, repairing engines. Some went back to cinema, theater, or architecture. And yet, in quiet conversations over beers or barbecues, they would tell stories that sounded like tall tales. Stories of how they fooled the Desert Fox himself, and how their creativity helped change the course of history. Historians today call Operation Bertram one of the most successful deceptions in modern warfare. But for the Australians who lived it, it was something more personal, a story of mateship, humor, and daring under impossible odds. Over 1,200 Australians lost their lives during the battles around El Alamein. Their sacrifice was enormous. Their courage is unforgettable. Yet their spirit lives on not just in monuments and medals, but in the lessons their ingenuity taught the world. They proved that war is not only fought with guns and tanks, but with ideas, and that sometimes the sharpest weapon a soldier can carry is imagination. From the deserts of North Africa to the digital age, the lessons of Bertram endure. Deception, disguise, and innovation remain at the heart of strategy, and the Australian contribution stands as one of the finest examples of tactical genius ever conceived. And behind that turning point in history, beyond the maps and medals, were men with paintbrushes and plywood who turned the tide of war with a lie so brilliant it became the truth that saved an empire. This has been the story of the Australian genius tactic that completely wrecked Rommel, a story of creativity, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of those who dare to dream in the desert. In the desert, the heat is merciless. The sand erases everything: footprints, tire tracks, even the scars of battle. But one thing it cannot erase is ingenuity. Because in 1942, a band of Australians proved that victory doesn't always belong to those with the biggest guns. Sometimes it belongs to those with the cleverest minds. They outwitted the Desert Fox himself and turned the tide of the war. The Australian genius tactic that wrecked Rommel wasn't just a trick of war. It was a triumph of imagination over fear, and a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments,